Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. A couple of weeks ago, we announced Backstory, our security telemetry platform, at the RSA conference in San Francisco. The interest has been pretty significant, and so today we'd like to provide an overview of the platform, talk about some key concepts, and walk through a couple of live demos. I'm Rick Kacha, the CMO at Chronicle, and I'm joined by my longtime colleague, Anch Patnaik, the Chief Product Officer here at Chronicle. Good morning, Anch.
Good morning, Rick.
First, a bit of housekeeping. This session is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be made available later. Ansh, did you know that nearly 2,000 people registered for this session today? No pressure on you, but maybe a little bit of pressure on you. Second, there's a chat panel in the WebEx meeting screen. So for people who are attending this webinar, please ask your questions in the chat panel, and we'll get to them later on in the hour. Okay, let's get going. Well, first off, we regularly get questions about Chronicle as a company and how it relates to Google and Alphabet. So let me just take a minute to begin here by clarifying. Chronicle is an Alphabet company, separate from Google, graduated from X in early 2018. That means things like our legal agreements, data access agreements, customer relationships are actually separate from Google. Our platform isn't a plugin on top of Google Cloud Platform. It's actually built separately and on core Google infrastructure. We bring that up because there's some confusion sometimes we find when we speak to people, so we want to call that out as we begin. But enough about Chronicle. Why don't we talk products? So Anch, as the head of products at Chronicle, I'm sure you're excited about Backstory and what it helps our customers to do. Maybe you can kick us off with an introduction to the platform.
Sure. First of all, we're really happy to be coming out of a great product launch at RSA, Rick. Backstory is a cloud-native security analytics platform that helps enterprise security analysts investigate incidents and hunt for threats. It joins VirusTotal in the Chronicle product portfolio, and it's also made smarter by Uppercase, which is a proprietary set of threat signals that are embedded in the Backstory system.
Okay, great. Maybe you can walk us through how they work, and then more importantly, how they work together.
Yeah, so let me tell you how they fit together. Most people know about VirusTotal. It's one of the world's largest malware intelligence services, over 1 billion files in aggregate and 1 million being added every day. So it has an unparalleled amount of information about malware, about bad domains, about linked IP addresses, the relationships between those indicators of compromise and their behavior. And security teams across the world use VirusTotal to learn about threats in the wild. But the question that a security analyst has after researching a threat in VirusTotal is, does this threat exist on my network? And that is a surprisingly difficult question to answer because most companies do not retain the telemetry that you'd need to answer this question. So you would need a year or more's worth of DNS traffic, of net flow, of endpoint telemetry, and essentially which leads to massive infrastructure that's too expensive and complex to capture and analyze. So it's hard to answer if any of these VirusTotal threats are in or were on your network easily.
Yeah, I had a customer recently describe VirusTotal to me as something like the FBI's most wanted list. And he said, it tells you all about the bad stuff out there, but he says it's actually more important for me to know if any of those bad guys are in my yard or in my house. So maybe if VirusTotal is the FBI most wanted list, Backstory is more like your Nest security camera. It tells you, what's going on in your home.
That's right. That's a very apt analogy. And in essence, we are introducing the answer to that with Backstory. So if you think about it, VirusTotal is really about answering questions about threats in the wild. And Backstory is how you find out what's actually in your own world or on your network. Backstory is a global, secure cloud platform for analyzing all your enterprise security telemetry, especially the high-volume telemetry that's typically ignored today, such as DNS, DHCP, NetFlow, proxy, and all the granular endpoint traffic. And what Backstory does is correlate all of this internal telemetry with external intelligence, such as VirusTotal metadata, threat feeds from third parties, and also our own curated feed, which is Uppercase. And Backstory can also do things that no other product does well today, and which we believe will really help security teams investigate incidents and hunt for threats in significantly better ways. Meanwhile, Uppercase is a special set of signals that's embedded into Backstory and curated from the 15 years of VirusTotal data that we have, and also analyzed by special internal tools as well. And so this combination of Backstory and VirusTotal and Uppercase creates a unique zero management required way to find, understand, and respond to attacks a lot better than before. You may have seen the recent Wall Street Journal piece on Google's own threat analysis group and how it protects Google's own data. Two of Chronicle's founders were also founders of that team. So the Chronicle products are inspired by the capabilities that are described in that Wall Street Journal article. It's an article that's on our site. We encourage you to read it.
Yeah, it's a great article, one of my favorites. It talks about how TAG uses VirusTotal plus special internal tools. And I know that you and the rest of the team use those as inspiration for building something that other companies could use to have those same kind of capabilities. Well, we've had a lot of prospects, certainly after the RSA launch, ask us how we view the market, where do we fit, who do we see as competition and partners. Maybe you could talk about the security analytics market a little bit for us, Ansh?
Sure. So one of the hottest topics in cybersecurity today is analytics. How do you get better at finding signal in the noise in the growing amount of data that companies generate? And the security analytics market is actually very challenging today. There's a new set of effective tools such as EDR that are far better at detecting and blocking threats, but they tend to generate lots of data, which is difficult to integrate into legacy SIEM products. And the SIEMs themselves are old, they're creaking, they're designed for a different world. Then there are centralized log management systems which cost a lot, that don't have a lot of security capabilities, and that require so-called ninjas to write massive amounts of complex queries to find anything useful. There are also intelligence feeds that are supposed to help, but more often than not, they just introduce a lot of noise. And so we see a lot of companies that are trying to dish this off to manage security service providers, but that only moves the problem around because the MSSPs don't have a magic wand to make big data issues disappear. And so forensics firms start jumping in and helping after the fact, but again, at a very high cost. So overall, it's a mess. CISOs have to knit too much together on their own, and they have to manage a lot of infrastructure, and they don't get the insights that they want. And so we think there's an opportunity to remake this market, and Backstory is our solution to doing just that. It adds value to products such as EDR by absorbing all the EDR telemetry and connecting it to other signals and logs. So it finds signals in telemetry in ways that SIEM products cannot. It retains the data in hot, full fidelity format for far longer than any legacy SIEM can. And it's smart on day one with special curated signals from data that only Chronicle sees. So we'll also be partnering with firms across the spectrum and making this available to MSSPs as well.
Yeah, I know we saw a lot of interest from partners following RSA, and we had a great experience there with some of our key partners. Those include managed service providers like Red Canary, companies that provide threat info such as Avast and Proofpoint, to all kinds of other companies that are sending their logs into Backstory. So maybe you could talk a little bit, Ansh, about how Backstory works?
Sure. So in terms of how Backstory works, we built a specialized layer over core Google infrastructure where you can privately upload and analyze all your enterprise telemetry. It's not scanned by Google or anyone else for any other purpose. It's also loaded with third-party feeds, a few of which are listed here, including data from Avast, hundreds of millions of consumer endpoints, Proofpoint's threat feed, and more. And then finally, we've augmented Backstory with 15 years of VirusTotal metadata and the proprietary Uppercase signals, which are curated by our own engineers from specialized data sets. So we offer a set of specialized applications for investigation, for hunting, for risky files and associated activity, and we'll be opening this up to our partners as well.
Okay, so sounds great. I think it's pretty great. Maybe you could walk through how this is different from other security analytics technologies. I know it's a question we get pretty often, and I know you believe it's different. Maybe you could walk through how that is.
Yeah, let me highlight a few things that I think are truly unique about the Backstory platform. First, just because of the nature of the underlying infrastructure on which we've built Backstory, this platform simply operates at a scale that's unique. So we just assume petabytes of data per customer. Maybe you don't generate that much today, but you probably will over time, and you'll want a system that operates at that sub-second latency level when you do. So the first thing is that Backstory simply chews through more data, more signals faster than anything else, and can therefore find things that are otherwise invisible. Second, this analysis not only works at scale in the present, it continuously reevaluates the past to show new threats that were previously seen as safe. So for example, if 6 months ago we saw a particular domain name in a threat feed indicated as safe, and today the feed provider flips and says, no, it actually serves up malware, then Backstory would automatically and instantly compare this to all historical activity and indicate which devices have ever communicated with that domain. And so this is something we inherit from the underlying platform, which is search indexing at zero latency. And we haven't seen anything like it in any other security product. Another point is system management. A big complaint from CISOs is that their analysts spend as much time and money keeping their SIM running as they do actually using it. And with Backstory, there's zero management that customers need to do. It's a cloud platform built on top of one of the world's most scalable, stable infrastructures. You get the benefit, but don't have to do anything in terms of resizing, tuning, backing up, buying memory, bandwidth, compute. It's all automatic in the same way that you don't have to tune Google before you run a search. So the operational cost and time savings compared to any on-premise big data system is just massive. I think another complaint from CISOs is the sheer difficulty of finding enough expertise on the market. Once you train a new analyst to use the arcane query language of your SIM, that person moves on and takes another job. Or you need 5 analysts to staff your SOC, but can only hire 2. Backstory doesn't present the data through any of these complex query interfaces, but uses a purpose-built application that can perform major analytics with nothing but point and click. So the learning curve is really tiny. And finally, I would also add that it makes no sense to provide a platform for analyzing massive amounts of data and then penalizing you for putting massive amounts of data into it. So we've priced Backstory on a flat model based on users and not on data volume. And this means it's not only a lot cheaper than alternative types of solutions, but also completely predictable. So you and your budget will know exactly what it costs when you sign up, and that will be true in subsequent years as well.
Wow, it sounds great. Thanks, Ansh. Well, let's see. Let's move on to the demo. Enough of the slides. We could transfer control over to Ansh, and we'll move to a live demo.
Great. So, Rick, now we're looking at the Backstory interface. There are a couple of ways to get to access the interface. This is one place where you can launch, and it's a simple search interface where you can enter either any asset identifier or any indicator of compromise. So I'm going to go through 2 scenarios, and the first one is a simple phishing scenario. So this is something that a lot of our customers actually have adapted their playbooks to use Backstory for. And that is just responding to a phishing signal or IOC that they've learned about. So just as an example, let's assume that you received an email from one of your end users to your security team, and they inform you about an email that looks suspicious. It has a domain, in this case, office36524.com. And luckily, this particular user didn't click into that link. But the question that you want to answer as a security analyst is whether other users may have accessed this domain. And that may have happened at any point in time in the past. So the first thing we want to be able to do is answer this question about who has reached out to an indicator of compromise, in this case a domain, but you could, in this interface, enter either a domain, a URL, an external IP address, or a file hash. So I'm going to search on this particular indicator of compromise, and as you can see, this takes us into what we call our domain view. So there are unique views for each type of indicator of compromise. The domain view, like all the other views, has no time dimension to the analysis. So as you can see in the top left, the first thing I would call out is that we are always searching across all time. You can restrict this if you want, but by default, with sub-second latency, we will find every match for this domain across all of your data. And so what I see here are that there are 6 distinct assets that reached out to this particular domain. And on the right-hand side in the main panel, you can see a lot of other contextual information that comes from who is data, for example. So the things to look for here might be things like, is this domain recently registered? And in the main panel, what's being plotted here is the prevalence or the frequency of outreach to this domain over time. So I can see that on a particular day, all these assets reached out to this particular domain. Now, down below, we provide context that provides a higher confidence on whether or not the domain is problematic. And that comes in the form of insights. Some of these insights come from VirusTotal, so all the metadata that we are curating behind the scenes. We've also partnered with various feeds that provide additional context. So in this case, Proofpoint's intelligence rep list tells me that this particular domain is in fact a drop site for logs in stolen credentials. So if you think about it, it seems like a simple question to ask, which is who's reached out to this domain? But in fact, it requires culling through a lot of different types of data. You need DNS data to understand what these endpoints reached out to. But in order to paint a clear picture around every asset, you have to stitch that with a lot of DHCP data to understand whether credentials might have been posted by an endpoint to this particular domain. You would need proxy logs as well. And then if you want to get down to understanding what happened on a compromised endpoint, you'd need EDR telemetry as well. And so behind the scenes, Backstory is stitching all of that together and painting this picture without imposing any query language. So what I instantly found is that these 6 assets have reached out to this domain. I'm going to toggle over to the timeline tab, which actually gives me the full chronology of all access to this particular domain. And when I expand the data here, I can actually start finding other interesting things. So I'm going to enter search for login, and this quickly highlights the events of interest. So in particular, what I can see here is that there are a couple of endpoints. Alice and Rita's endpoints did post credentials to login.php. So now I know which particular assets to focus on, because these are the ones that perhaps presented credentials and may have been compromised. Expanding on this, Office 365 24.com was hosted on this particular IP address. So the resolved IPs gives you the passive DNS history of the domain. And this is a quick way of expanding that search into other related badness that might be involved in this particular attack. So I'm going to click into this particular IP address. And again, now we're pivoting out of the domain view and into what's called an IP-centric view. Very similar in the flow of information, but the distinction is that I can now see that on this particular IP address, there are 2 additional assets that reached out to communicated with this IP address. And so we quickly have expanded the potential threat from those 6 assets, from the 2 that actually reached out to posted credentials. And now on the timeline, I can additionally see whether there might have been any other hosts that presented credentials to this particular domain or variants of this domain that were hosted on the same IP address. And sure enough, I now see a third endpoint, which in this case is Paul Roberts' laptop, that also reached out to this particular IP address. So very quickly, we managed to navigate through all of the DNS data, stitch that with the DHCP data, and with the proxy logs to quickly find out what are the assets that were actually compromised. We pivoted on DNS history to expose other assets that reached out to that same underlying infrastructure that was used as part of this campaign. So that's one scenario, Rick. I want to go through a second scenario, which expands out from the search-centric approach to real-time alerting and correlation.
Okay.
So I'm pivoted now into what is our enterprise insights view, and this is a way for us to expose and to continuously correlate and surface interesting findings or matches. In this case, there are a couple of panels here that I'll highlight. The first one is an IOC domain match panel, which basically shows you threat intelligence that we've correlated across all traffic. So let's go through a couple of specific rows here. So the first one, as you can see, there's a domain called checkmalware.info, which is associated with APT28, SOPHICY, and the source is Open Source Intelligence Watch List, and there's an asset that we can see that did reach out to this domain. But the interesting thing about this particular outreach is that the IOC is something that we learned about as being an APT-related domain only 20 hours ago. But as you can see, it was first seen on our network 6 months ago. So this is actually one of the most common challenges that we hear about in our customer, as we talk to customers. No one's able to keep this volume of information to be able to answer this kind of recursive question on whether new intelligence matches something across all history of telemetry. So in this case, we're continuously evaluating every change in IOC verdicts against all your data. And so instantly uncovering that even though this IOC was something that was classified as associated with APT 28 20 hours ago, we instantly find the match and the outreach to this domain, which happened 6 months ago. Further down, you see another domain, which is the servehalflife.com domain. Notice that this is also a malware observation APT activity classified domain according to the DHS feed, and we see that there's a specific asset that reached out to it. Now, the interesting thing in this particular case is that the ingest time was 4 months ago. So we learned about the classification of this domain a while back, but notice that the outreach to this domain is fairly recent. So this might be a trigger for me to drill down into this particular domain further. And as I click into that domain, I basically pivot out of that Enterprise Insights view and back into the domain view that you saw in the previous use case as well. And what I see is that there's one asset, Todd Fields PC, that first accessed this domain on February 22nd, and most recently on March 26th. So as you can see, there's a lot of data curation happening behind the scenes. Once again, that's a lot of contextual data that accompanies this information. So we can see prevalence, which is the frequency of outreach to this domain. And it essentially looks like this domain reached out on almost a daily basis. Classic beaconing behavior. I could see the past IP history for this domain, as we saw in the phishing example, other context from VirusTotal, and any matches across any of our intelligence feeds. This is contextual, so the feeds that have a match would show up, and those that don't show up. So in this case, there was a match to certain information in VirusTotal as well as the DHS feed. What I'd like to do is to click into this particular PC. And understand what might have been happening around the time that Todd's laptop first accessed this domain. What triggered this? When I do that, I essentially pivot one more time from a IOC-centric dimension, which was the domain dimension, into what is an asset-centric view. And what you're seeing here on the left-hand side in timeline is the entirety of all endpoint and network telemetry associated with this asset around the time that we pivoted in or we navigated into this view. So as you can see here, all the network connections, all endpoint telemetry is chronologically shown on the timeline view. I can see all the distinct domains that this particular asset reached out to in this 10-minute time frame that's initially shown here. What's plotted here in the middle is this notion of prevalence with an inverted log scale. And the idea is to expose traffic that might be anomalous. So prevalence essentially being the frequency at which the enterprise has reached out to specific domains relative to this particular asset. So what happens here is domains that are frequently accessed by lots of assets in your organization will sink to the bottom, and the more rare outreach from this asset will bubble up to the top. Now, when we come in here, the default time frame is a 10-minute time frame. I'm going to expand that to a couple of hours so we can get more context. As you can see on the left-hand side, I now see that there are 1,600 domains that this particular asset reached out to across this 2-hour time frame. There are about 2,500 events that are associated with this particular endpoint. I'm going to reduce the prevalence using this slider to filter out the noise and focus on just the high volume, the low prevalence traffic. And when I do that, as you can see, we narrow this down to just a smaller set of events, 18 events in this case. And as I mouse over the particular, the visualization here, I could see that this particular asset initially reached out to upinfo.biz, then reached out to officerevision.com. And the larger bubbles indicate initial outreach. Subsequent outreach is the smaller bubbles. This makes it easier to visualize beaconing behavior quickly. And then I also see this third domain that it reaches out to a little later. The thing that's interesting here is notice that there's this triangle here, which orange triangle, which represents alerts that we're collecting from various security devices such as firewalls. So at some point there was suspicious traffic that was detected and potentially blocked. But what happened is that the malware pivoted and switched to a different domain. Down below, you can see the context, additional context that we mentioned earlier. So here are the forwarded alerts that are associated with this particular asset around the time of the investigation. These are the domains that are new to the enterprise that this asset has reached out to. Always interesting to see domains that are new to the enterprise because they're likely to be more suspicious. These 3 domains also happen to be low in prevalence, which adds more confidence that they're worth investigating further. And then we can see the specific judgments from any intelligence sources that they match. Here what we see is that the DHS feed confirms that all 3 of the domains, the low prevalence domains that this asset reached out to, are associated with APT activity. So far, we've talked mostly about network level behavior. I want to switch sort of the attention on the left-hand side to the chronology of specific events on this asset. So if you notice on the left, there's this initial outreach to upinfo.biz. And that's chased by a process start, which is ghost.exe. I'm going to expand this, and this is the first example where you're seeing how we pull in endpoint or EDR telemetry and stitch that together with all the network telemetry. So I see outreach to a suspicious domain. I see the start of this process, and then I see this additional information here. Now, on this particular laptop, there's probably a lot that's happening around this time. What I can clearly see is that ghost.exe is probably a suspicious process that's worth investigating further. And in order to focus just on the events that are associated with this process, I can use something called procedural filtering. And procedural filtering is a very convenient and intuitive way of focusing the investigation without having to engage with any complex search syntax. So I can filter by event type, by log source, by process. In this particular case, I'm going to collapse the various attributes and focus on the process name. What I want to do is limit this to just events that are associated with ghost.exe. And when I do that, you can now see that I've limited the events on the left to just what is going to end up becoming the kill chain, if you will, associated with ghost.exe, which is a Windows-based remote access Trojan malware. And here's how it plays out. The process kicks off. It reaches out to officerevision.com. You can see that it attempts to write this file to disk, which is a way of achieving persistence, and closes with the registry mod followed by continued beaconing out to that third domain eventually once the second one gets blocked. So very quickly, we could encapsulate just the events that are associated with this particular malware or compromise. There are a few things I'll close out with here, Rick. One is this information is stateful, so the URLs preserve state. So if you push this into any workflow tool, the next analyst who is triaging this would have exactly this view, would see exactly this kill chain. Secondly, you can download just these events and push that into a CSV, as I just did. And so very quickly, just to close this out, Rick, we started by looking at about 2,500 events on this endpoint. We narrowed it down by intuitively using both the prevalence filter, expanding the time, and then using filtering to limit it down to just the events that are part of this kill chain. And this is probably the second very common way in which customers are now using Backstory, in addition to the phishing example that I provided.
Wow, that's great. It's a great demo. Switch control back over to me, please. Great, I love it. I know we gave that demo hundreds and hundreds of times at RSA. And I was like it every time I see it. Okay, so before we wrap up, I do want to revisit Ansh's last point before the demo around what makes this different, and that's pricing. We think, so Backstory gives you a cloud-native private place to analyze your security data safely. And as part of, oops, I'm sorry, I've just been told that I am not showing my screen, so let me try it again. Okay, great. So I was talking about some points that didn't come through. I'll try it again. The point of Backstory is to give our customers a cloud-native private area to upload and analyze their security telemetry safely and privately. And basically, as part of our mission to give good the advantage and to help our customers better protect themselves, we want to remove the barriers to you actually analyzing your own data. Privacy is part of that, and pricing is a big part of that. It makes no sense to give you a system, as Ansh said, where you can securely upload and analyze petabytes of your own telemetry if we then penalize you price-wise for doing so. So the pricing model for Backstory is different from other systems. It's not based on data volume. It's based on users. And there are actually a couple of questions that came in over the chat during the demo asking about, what do you mean by users? Are these Chronicle or Backstory users or something else? We mean size of the organization, so sort of EMPs and temps, people with accounts that they need to be monitored. We think this model brings significant scale advantages and really reduces costs for customers. You should be able to put in and can put in very high volume security telemetry, things like DNS, EDR, NetFlow data that simply would kill any sort of SIM today. And this subscription comes with 1 year of full retention baked in. All data is hot, full fidelity. It's not like you get 7 days or 30 days and then the rest is on tapes or some sort of cold storage. It's all there. It's an all-in price. You aren't paying extra for cloud storage or compute. So a very low fixed price where everything is all in. We think that is extremely disruptive and will allow people to do things they simply couldn't do otherwise.
Thanks, Rick. So to wrap things up, Rick, I'd like to say that we invite all the attendees to arrange for a detailed demo to speak with us about what their security needs are around analytics. And we'll leave you with this. Why do we think Backstory helps give good the advantage? It's the only security analytics system that, as a layer on top of core Google infrastructure, is built for massive security data with a fixed pricing model that's priced for massive security data, and with the specialized feeds and analytics capabilities that we've created, can harness massive security data.
Great. Well, before we move to Q&A, let me call out a couple of links that attendees might find useful. The first is chronicle.security/resources. We have white papers for Backstory and for VirusTotal, recorded demos, and so forth. Go there and look at those. We also are starting to spend quite a bit of time and effort going into events around the country, and you can see our upcoming schedule of events at chronicle.security/events. We'll update that very regularly. We did have one question that came in a couple of times over the chat window, which is how do I become a partner? If you go to chronicle-security/partners, there's more information on the partner types, and at the bottom of that page is a link to a partner sign-up form. So you can go there. And then finally, if you have a specific question, want to set up a meeting, anything really, go to chronicle.security/contact. It'll take you to a form where you can type in your question, and we'll respond ASAP. So with that, let's move on to some questions. Ansh, I'm going to pick through some things here. A lot have come in. One that's interesting is Backstory only based in the cloud, or is there an on-prem service? No, it's a cloud-based service. We believe that's where this is going, and we believe the power of the system and the economics and scale of it makes sense in the cloud. So you can stream your data from on-prem into Backstory, but Backstory runs on our infrastructure. Another question, Ansh, is around EDR data. So specifically, how does Backstory take in EDR data? Do you work with specific vendors? Do you manually load it in? How do we get the data in?
Yeah, so and maybe at a higher level, let me address the concept of data collection. So there are various different ways in which the Backstory platform can collect data. There is a lightweight component called a forwarder, which can be deployed both as a container and as an executable in a Windows environment, and that can pull from an existing SIEM. It can do packet capture, and then we can filter up traffic for specific traffic. So, for example, DNS and DHCP, proxy logs, just the data that we need. It can also collect from any syslog source. So that's one common way in which we pull data. There are certain platforms, in particular when we're talking about EDR, there's a spread across these solutions in terms of how they are deployed. So, for example, some solutions like CrowdStrike have a cloud-based logging mechanism. So we collect directly from their cloud environment using the keys that a customer gives us. We also collect off of data that's pushed to, let's say, a cloud bucket. So there are lots of different ways in which we're collecting this data. Across all the customers we worked with so far, I would say that there are a few EDR vendors in particular that dominate, and those would be CrowdStrike, Carbon Black, Tanium, Endgame. But it's fairly easy for us to extend support to new products.
Actually, one question that just popped in a few minutes ago regarding endpoint from Joshua. Is Backstory intended to work with endpoint solutions or to replace them? No, the answer is definitely complementary, not to replace them, to work with them. We think those are great products. One of the challenges with having them inspect the endpoint the way they do is they generate a ton of data. And, customers, most of those products include maybe a month or 30 days of retention of that data. And so if you're a customer, like, what do I do if I want to keep that data for longer and correlate it to other sources that aren't on the endpoint? So we've worked with all of the leading vendors to integrate the products, and we think the combination of great EDR products, streaming longer-term data back to Backstory, where we can correlate it and connect it to other data, is pretty useful. So let's see. We've got a lot of custom questions that are kind of the same thing, and I'm just trying to summarize them all. So one question that's come up a few times here, Ansh, is, what do I do if I have a new or unique log source that maybe Backstory doesn't do today? I'm summarizing like 6 or 8 of these questions. They seem to all be asking, how do I get new data into Backstory? Yeah,
that's a great question, and it's a common one that we get. So one of the capabilities that we're introducing very soon is the notion of advanced search. So as you saw in the demo today, we're definitely focused on addressing specific jobs around threat investigation and threat hunting, which operate on specific data sets and which correlate a lot of the underlying data around DNS, DHCP, proxy logs, EDR logs, and all kinds of alerts from various security tools. But it's common for customers to then want to bring in other sources that might provide additional forensic context. So we have defined a data model for that spans data types, that spans asset awareness, user awareness, and have built the notion of what's called a configuration-based normalizer that allows us to bring in new data sets fairly easily. Today, we're doing a lot of this directly ourselves and through some partners, but in the near future, we will be exposing this so that end customers can also bring in custom data sources using that same configuration-based normalizer.
Great. Okay, here's a good question. How does this integrate with items like threat intelligence platforms?
Yeah, that's another common question we get. So as you probably noticed in the demo, there are various threat intelligence feeds that we have embedded into the platform. That includes, virus total intelligence, proof points, and reputation lists for domains and URLs. We have Avast and its file verdicts that we've partnered with them for, and this set of global intelligence feeds is going to expand over time. Separate from that, it's common for our customers to also have existing threat intelligence curation in a threat intelligence platform, like an Anomaly or a Threat Connect. And so we've also added support for what are customer-specific or custom IOC feeds. So in addition to the global feeds, some of which you saw in the demo today, customers can also bring in data that's already curated or intelligence that's already curated in their existing threat intelligence platform that may already span dozens or more threat intelligence feeds. So our goal is to use this data as context for analysis, not necessarily to replace them.
Great. We've gotten interested in the last few minutes. A lot of questions came in from MDR providers, managed detection and response providers. Can they work with Backstory? Will we work with them? Yes, we have multiple MDR partners already in place. We think this is a great way to add signal to your service. Again, if you go to chronicle.security/partners, there's a link at the bottom of the page that will send your information to our alliances team, and they will work with you. A lot of questions. So if I look at a lot of questions that came in, they all are some flavor of can Backstory handle particular logs from other clouds, if I have to summarize these, AWS or other types of clouds. Ansh, what about getting, one key thing with Chronicle as a company being an independent company inside of Alphabet and Backstory being a relatively neutral to work with data from anywhere, what are your thoughts on how they might pull data from clouds such as Amazon?
Yeah, so Rick, that's an important part of the way we have evolved is as an agnostic platform that can collect data from any source, be it on-prem, be it from Google Cloud or other cloud platforms. And so, as I mentioned, there are various different ways in which we can collect data. We can pull from a cloud bucket. We have built over 80 parsers for specific data sources some of which are on-prem focused, others that are in the cloud. But it's easy enough for us to ingest data of any type, whether it's an on-prem security data source or telemetry that's coming from a cloud platform, regardless of whether it's Google Cloud or Amazon or Azure. And our customers really do represent a mix of all of that information.
Here's a specific question that I like a lot from John. Are you focusing on certain log information like NetFlow, DNS firewall, or do you have a future roadmap in terms of data collection analytics? John, I think it's a good question. It gets to this notion of what kind of data do you want to put in Backstory. I think the idea originally was there for certain types of data, there's lots of ways people are collecting it and doing some analysis on it today. But there's very useful, typically happens to also be high volume data types that the founders here in their prior work at Google and Google Security found to be extremely useful. Things like DNS data that are useful to have for a variety of purposes and in high volume and over a large period of time, but nobody would ever put that in like a SIM for a year. So we started with the kind of data types that other people weren't collecting and typically keeping and searching, but we knew to be useful because those are hard. And then things that are, other types of logs that are pretty straightforward or easy to add. Ansh talked a little bit about advanced search and how those are coming. So the notion was to start with some of the harder, high volume things that people don't have access to today in their own environments, and then add the easier things later. Here's a question. How do you make sure the data being sent from endpoints is secure? And this is from Anthony. I think we want to break this into two things because there's been a few questions around endpoint and endpoint agent. I think maybe, Ansh, you could talk about the fact that there's no agent that we put on the things. And then second, how the data securely comes from a customer environment to Backstory.
Sure. That's a good point. It's easy to assume that the notion of the forwarder is on every endpoint, but that's not the case. Most of our customers have a forwarder deployed in each just one forwarder deployed that's collecting all the data. As I mentioned, it can receive all kinds of security telemetry over syslog, can pull from existing log aggregation points or SIMs, can do packet capture. But this forwarder then, once it receives the data, it pushes that data securely back into a private instance for a given customer in the cloud as encrypted data. So it uses something called gRPC, which is a secure mechanism for transferring data into Google Cloud.
Question from Farhan around, does the zero latency ingestion apply to all log sources?
Yes, it does. So one of the things that's really, I think, amazing about what Backstory offers is that the latency between the point at which we receive data and when it becomes available in the interface is literally at the sub-second level. And that's really amazing. You could see it when you play around with the product, either in our sandbox or as you trial it. Obviously, there can be potential delays on the network getting the data in, but once it hits our pipeline, our data pipeline, we are able to index, normalize, and surface data, including doing some of the analysis, such as matching all historical data against new contextual information literally instantly. And hopefully you saw some of that in the demo as well.
Yeah, I have to say, having spent a large portion of my career in the SIM industry, I've never seen anything like that, the instant reevaluation before. A lot of questions around APIs. Does Chronicle have an API? Maybe we can talk a little bit about API.
Yeah, so we are in the process of releasing both our ingest APIs and our read APIs. We'll start initially with the ingest APIs, and the effort there is around expanding coverage for more data sources and opening it up to partners to bring data in. And then separately from that, there's been a lot of asks from partners, managed security service providers, as well as just organizations wanting to layer workflow and existing playbooks on top of Backstory, for which we're also in the process of exposing and documenting our read side APIs.
Here's a good question. I noticed in your demo you mentioned network connections to presumably malicious domains. How does Backstory provide details on the, how do you know those are malicious? How do you provide information on the nature of that connection?
That's a great question. So if you notice that on every one of the views that we went through, so there's an asset-centric view, and then there are IOC-centric views. The IOC-centric views today are focused around a domain, potentially an external IP address, a URL, and coming very soon, a file hash. So there are different ways in which you can look at an IOC. And then the context of whether something is suspicious or malicious comes from multiple signals. There can be information that's coming from threat intelligence sources that we have embedded in, so global threat intelligence feeds. There could be custom threat intelligence feeds that are being pulled in from a customer's threat intelligence platform. And hopefully you also saw that there are other confidence signals that we provide. So for example, in the case of a domain, even if you didn't have a match with the threat intelligence feed, presumably because the research industry may not be aware that a particular domain is malicious or is used as part of an APT campaign. Even so, there are other pieces of information that might warrant investigation into that domain. And those were the insight boxes that we showed in the demo. So that might be information around, is that domain new to the internet as a whole, recently registered? How frequently has it been reached out to in terms of prevalence by your enterprise? And so these other insights provide added confidence on top of the direct matches with threat intelligence feeds.
So I think we're hitting the top of the hour. Maybe one last question here from Ivan around how are the asset information populated and maintained? Maybe this is take a few seconds to talk about aliasing and how it works.
So one of the things that's very difficult to do actually in just even answering simple questions such as, let's just say you're chasing an alert that comes from one of your security devices. Perhaps your firewall blocked traffic from an endpoint and you're tasked with triaging and investigating what was happening on that asset around that time. Right? So certain traffic was blocked, but there might be related traffic that didn't get blocked because the firewall may not have been aware of that traffic leading to something malicious. So when you start investigating an asset over even a small window of time, there's a lot of stitching of data that has to happen, because at that particular point in time, you have to answer the question, what was the IP address that this particular asset had? Then you need to understand the DNS history, the IP addresses that particular asset had over whatever period you want to investigate. So let's say you want to look at the entire day of what was happening on an asset. You need to now be stitching together a lot of DHCP data to paint this picture around a unified picture around an asset and everything that happened on it across all of the IP leases that it may be involved on that asset over a given time. So one of the things that's happening behind the scenes constantly with Chronicle essentially in real time is the stitching together of DHCP data and all the related network telemetry to paint a picture around what is happening on an asset. And that's a very key part of what allows us to present this information in a very simple way, which normally would require lots of slow, tedious searches and sequential searches that would have to be stitched together. All of that is happening transparently behind the scenes in real time in the Backstory platform.
Okay, well, so we're at the top of the hour. We've made our way through a small number of the questions. We will have to wrap this up. We will log the rest of the questions and get back to people with answers, ones that we didn't address here. So with that, Ansh, thank you for the great demo and the great overview. Everyone, thanks for joining. We look forward to seeing you again soon. For upcoming events, you can go to chronicle.security/events and see upcoming webinars and shows we'll be at. With that, thanks very much.